What's going on, everybody? I'm Sage, and I wanted to make a quick video going over the recent changes that they have implemented for the developer notes and some of the things that they have done to really improve Feral Druid. They gave a lot into quality of life things, and ultimately, it's definitely a buff across the board for us. So let's go ahead and dive into it. This is kind of piggybacking off of the last little information that we had on one of the previous videos I've made. We kind of talked about the positioning of the new talents that they were going to do and where they were going to end up. And pretty much they met exactly what we were speculating on and kind of hoping for. So that first one is going to be over here with Lunar Inspiration. It's jumping down from right below double clawed rake and moving over right next to protective growth. In my personal assessment of it, I wanted it to just kind of switch places with protective growth, but they just put it right next to it, which is pretty much the exact same thing, which is phenomenal for that single target build. You don't have to go into double AOE talents in order to obtain your Lunar Inspiration, which is great. For single target, we're definitely going to be able to take this now, as long as obviously all the numbers and stuff come out, which it does seem like it will. So we're going to be taking that Lunar Inspiration as we go down the tree. The second one is Sudden Ambush had a very good talent hidden behind it, and that was Infected Wounds. And one of the things we kind of wish that it would do is either swap places with it. We even talked about it joining in the center here, which is what happened. The Moment of Clarity move, I mentioned that I like where it's at, and I hope that they don't, place it behind anything. And it's literally, it was just moving like, not even an inch to the left, to make room for infected wounds. And they just put it smack dab in the center, which is phenomenal. This is a huge damage increase to all of our builds because we don't have to sink the 2 points into sudden ambush in order to get it. So especially on AoE builds, double clawed rake and infected wounds are definitely going to be a go-to build now, for all AoE. And you're going to want to make sure that you're actually applying this more frequently. Obviously, in like mass AoE, when there's a ton of targets, you're going to still want to do more of that just simple primal wrath spam. However, once you get into that like 4 targets, maybe even 5 target-ish area, maybe 4 to 6 target range, you're probably be getting some of these multiple rakes out across those targets, and then proceeding on with the primal wrath and swiping. But this is a phenomenal win for us. Quality of life for all the builds. Single target build, quality of life, AoE build, quality of life. Infected wounds is going to be taken for both of them because it's very strong for in both of those builds. And so I definitely think that the majority of people will end up taking infected wounds tied in with double clawed for AoE and infected wounds by itself with lunar inspiration for single target, and then going down the tree. It still gives you you do have to find the point, right? Because on the build I typically play, which is exactly the way it is on the screen, except for 1 point, which we took the 1 point out of our tireless energy and we placed it inside infected wounds. So we are losing 30 of that maximum energy increase, as well as 10% of that energy regeneration. However, this is in a Mythic Plus AoE scenario, so you're going to have things dying, which Apex Predator gives you a ton of that energy. Tireless energy was just more so to help facilitate, being able to keep up the spam is ultimately what it comes out to. And the one tier down from this is definitely worth taking infected wounds in order to get that increased 30% damage, because now you're getting increased 30% damage across 2 targets every time you press your rake. Which is very big damage for us. This also goes very good into the Adaptive Swarm build. Currently, I'm playing my Carnivorous Instincts build, but if you go in Adaptive Swarm is just, once again, it's increasing all of your bleeds by 25% effectiveness, which obviously includes your infected wounds as well. Infected wounds rake, so includes your rakes. So that's all really big wins for us. So that's the talent moves that they did for us, and I don't honestly think that they need to do too much more. The only other thing that, because when I was talking about like the tree and like what I would change with it, if there was anything, like this tree is very good, but if I were to change anything, they pretty much did it with the lunar inspiration and the infected wounds coming out of there. I still don't like the fact that sudden ambush is 2 points. It definitely feels like it's kind of blocking you because you want to take it for single target, but you have to sink 2 into it. And that's going to come out to a numbers game, really, because the way I've been testing it is that ultimately it gives Rake another 4 to 5% like consistent because of how often it procs, making sure that you get the procs and use it on those rakes, so on and so forth, is in that 4.5, 5% in total from what I've been testing. Obviously, Sims will tell you the exact number, but it adds a lot of RNG to it. To making sure that, that's viable. And since it's only 4 to 5, then placing those 2 points to get down, placing 1 point in rampant ferocity to get down the tree faster, might actually be the play, because then it allows you to select other talents, which are some of these talents for 1 point give you kind of 6%, like Berserk Frenzy on single target kind of gives you that 6%, depending on what talents you're building into it and how you're kind of optimizing inside your Berserk window. So it kind of just ultimately depends on the numbers. A lot of the numbers are pretty close together on a lot of single target builds. Obviously, there's the massive owl weaving one and stuff. And at some point later on, when stuff gets a little bit more sorted out, I'll make like a single target video of like what's probably going to be top, and then like what's going to be like the normal rotation for average players that don't want to sit there and try to owl weave everything in. But anyway, this is going to probably be the build that I try out next, because I'm super excited. And testing this out in Heroic is super hard, because Heroic level dungeons, because everything just dies, right? There's so much damage and everybody's amped up on gear at this point that everything just falls over instantly. So it's very hard to test without Mythic Plus. So I'm hoping that this weekend, when we jump into Mythic Plus, we get to mess around and see that 30% increased damage, and see how much we can actually apply that, and overall the dungeon, how much that actually increases. Because in that AOE scenario, you're not pressing a massive amount. You're not tab targeting and like clicking around to spread your rakes as much, but you definitely could, right? Instead of just throwing a swipe out, you could put 2 of these rakes out, which 2 of these rakes out could definitely be competitive in the damage with 1 swipe. And that's kind of like where that number lies. Is it worth pressing to get 2 rakes out versus just 1 swipe, is where that damage number is going to compete against. And it very well might, because this is also getting amplified by our tier set. Which is the next thing I want to go over, is our feral tier set has been changed up, which is pretty much, instead of it just our finishing moves are increasing, instead of it just being all of our bleeds, they specifically listed it to rip, rake, and thrash. And I think they did this for a couple of reasons, because we have a lot of like off type bleeds that we could be just dipping in continuously, because we're just amplifying. We're technically putting more bleeds on a target, even though it is technically just the same rip bleed. And that comes down to another thing that they've changed, and they've buffed, which is rip and tear. So coming down here to rip and tear, this one right here is applying rip to a target also applies a tear that deals 12% of the new rip's damage over 6 seconds. It's actually over 8 seconds, but since we have Circle and Life and Death, it takes it down from 8 to 6. Which initially I thought that was just like a bug. I thought they didn't implement it incorrectly, and it was just always 8. But then I realized that Rip and Tear is affected by Circle and Life and Death. So they pretty much just doubled this damage, but I think that they doubled it to compensate for the fact that it got taken out of the damage amp from our tier set. So I still think it's a buff, but just like a very slight buff, right? I don't think it's as much as we actually think that it is, because it going from 6%, getting that 6% increased gain, isn't going to be, actually it's slight nerf, I guess. Overall, it's not a ton though. But ultimately, like what they've done here is just try to take it out of the tier set, make sure our core abilities are what's going to get amped up by the tier set, and then give us a lot of quality of life in our tree with those 2 abilities that they moved around. Um, so that's a lot of the big information I wanted to go over. There was also another change that they did, where our Killer Instincts, apparently there was a bug in this, and I would have never known this. But apparently there's a bug where it wasn't affecting melee damage. Um, so they announced that they put a fix in so that the 6% increased physical damage is going to apply to our melee strikes, which is good, because our melee is normally nowhere near the top of our damage meters, and it's still very much not, but it is a little bit higher from what I've been testing so far. Obviously, it's hard to test other than just playing on some dummies. So you know, we get a little bit of a buff there. That's going to be pretty minor buff because it's just affecting our melees by 6%, which isn't a ton of damage because melees in general don't do a ton of damage. However, the big changes are infected wounds being accessible now for just 1 point for 30% increased damage gain, which is 30% across 2 targets if you take double clawed rake, and lunar inspiration being accessible for single target builds. I really doubt that you're ever going to take this inside a dungeon, unless like there's a reason, like it's super powerful in single target, but it doesn't seem powerful enough to take over the damage you would gain through any, even on a tyrannical week, like the damage that you would gain from like double claw rake and infected wounds and stuff is still going to probably outdo lunar inspiration, as well as you probably never press this as a GCD in AoE. That's ultimately the majority of what I wanted to go over is the new changes. I think that what they're doing for Feral is awesome. There's so many different ways that you can play Feral, which is awesome that there is. Like talents and talents builds should be at that point where like people can play different versions of the spec. Obviously, Sims will come out and say, "Oh, this is the most damage if you play perfectly on the this amount of targets consistently." However, Mythic Plus can never be correctly simmed, right? It's one of those things where it's like you can amp in for the most damage in every given scenario and try to sim it the best you can, just to see what the optimal results would be in a perfect scenario. But it ultimately comes down to how well you can play it, that spec inside that environment, and then how well it synergizes with the rest of your group. And there's multiple builds. The adaptive swarm build. There's a convoke burst build. Especially like a convoke burst build for single target tyrannical bosses. You could definitely go that way. You can go into like a mini single target amp up, especially towards the bottom of the tree. Go for like that mini single target increased damage, and still have like primal wrath to be able to AoE. So like if there's dungeons that are going to have very little trash inside it, and then multiple bosses, kind of like a Theater of Pain style, then you can opt into that kind of build. And it's just they give us so many options. Past that, if Feral goes completely live the way it is, as far as like the talents, I think that they've done a phenomenal job. I really like that they've listened, they've iterated. We've had several iterations of the Feral Druid tree. We can spec into more healing, we can spec into more tanking, we can spec into utility we want. We can have multiple different versions of single target, multiple different versions of AoE. We can have a combination of the two. I think that the Feral Druid tree is in a very good state going into Dragonflight. And Feral has gone through a ton of change, and I think that this is all in the right direction for us, for just the entire class in general. Because if this is where we start, then hopefully, we can keep getting some improvements from here on. However, they've drastically changed this to be very competitive in a Mythic Plus scenario, as well as still be doing good, very decent single target, and that is a great place to be, instead of just being very good at single target and not being very good at anything else, which is kind of where we've been at for a little bit. We've been kind of facilitating that very good at single target and not very good at anything else role for a minute now. Last time I could think of doing some big damage in Mythic Plus was Legion. Very cool to see. Very fun to play. Very fun builds to play. And if you want complexity, there is a ton of things that you can add to amp up the complexity. Making sure you're monitoring the sudden ambush procs. Making sure that you're monitoring your rake, your rip, your thrash, as well as making sure that you're monitoring your saber tooth buff to those bleed, to that rip bleed. Monitoring your lunar inspiration moonfire, and then obviously all of your cooldowns, your Berserk cooldown if you're taking Convoke as a cooldown, your Adaptive Swarm cooldown, your Feral Frenzy cooldown. Like there's a good amount to track, and there's so many things that are amplifying it up. If Tiger's Fury and you amplified it with Tiger's Fury, if you amplified it with Tiger's Fury Blood Talons, if you amplified it with Tiger's Fury, Blood Talons, and a sudden ambush proc for that rake, so on and so forth. Like there's a lot of things that you can do in here, and obviously if you want to go even further, you can owl weave and make it even more complex by
throwing in some spells that aren't typically inside the Feral Druid kit, getting those Sunfires out there. We have that instant cast Star Surge now that you can weave in there. Technically, you can double up Moonfires, but the Moonfire from like the human Boomkin form is pretty weak in my opinion. So I don't think that I'm gonna press that button, at least as of right now. Even though you can double them up right now. Um, but yeah, I'm very excited, and let me hear what you guys think and your feedback. And you know, I think I'll end that discussion there. Farrell's looking good and in a good spot, and we just have to keep hoping that we stay tuned accordingly and that some people don't get boosted too far ahead of us. There are a lot of changes that came out, and we'll have to see. Past that, if you guys like the video, like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be rolling out some more videos here shortly. All right, thank you. Bye bye.